Chapter 13, Section 4 and 5 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 13, The Principate of Tiberius. Section 4 to 5. Section 4. Parthia and the Eastern Question. Among other slanders, it was said that Tiberius in his island retreat was indifferent to the government of the empire. The rumour seems to have reached the Parthian court and encouraged the Parthian king Artabanus to assume a hostile attitude. The peace with Parthia was undisturbed until the death of Artaxerxes, king of Armenia, about 34 A.D. Artabanus, elated by a long and successful reign, and thinking that the old Tiberius would not be likely to undertake an eastern war, seized the opportunity to transfer Armenia from dependence on Rome to dependence on Parthia. He induced the Armenians to elect his son Arsaces as successor to Artaxerxes. He even seemed to court a war with Rome, and addressed insulting letters to the emperor, demanding the inheritance of his own rival Vonones, who had died in Cilicia, insisting on the old boundaries of Macedonia and Persia, and threatening that he would seize the territories possessed long ago by Cyrus and afterwards by Alexander the Great. Tiberius was unequal to the emergency. He conferred upon Lucius Vitellius, an able and resolute officer, the same powers which he had before conferred upon his nephew Germanicus, and sent him to the east, with orders to cross the Euphrates at the head of the Syrian legions if it should prove needful. At the same time he set up a rival to Arsaces in the person of Mithridates, brother of Pharasmanes, king of the Iberians, and stirred up both the Iberians and Albanians to support his claim by an invasion of Armenia. Mithridates gained possession of the Armenian capital, Artaxata, and his rival Arsaces was removed by poison. King Artabanus then sent another of his sons, Orodes, to take the place of Arsaces, and recover Armenia, but the Parthian cavalry proved no match for the Caucasian infantry and the Sarmatian mounted archers, which supported Pharasmanes and Mithridates. A lively description of the warfare has come down to us. Pharasmanes challenged Orodes to battle, taunted him when he refused, rode up to the Parthian camp, and harassed their foraging parties. The Parthians at length became impatient and called upon their prince to lead them to battle. In the fight which ensued every variety of warfare was to be witnessed. The Parthians, accustomed to pursue or fly with equal skill, deployed their cavalry, and sought scope for the discharge of their missiles. The Sarmatians, throwing aside their bows, which at a shorter range are effective, rushed on with pikes and swords. There were alternate advances and retreats, then close fighting, in which, breast to breast with the clash of arms, they drove back the foe or were themselves repulsed. The Albanians and Iberians seized the Parthian riders, and hurled them from their horses. The Parthians were thus pressed on one side by the cavalry on the heights, on the other by the infantry in close quarters. The leaders, Pharasmanes and Orodes, were conspicuous, encouraging the brave, succouring those who wavered, and at length recognizing each other they rushed to the combat on galloping chargers and with poised javelins. The force of Pharasmanes was greater, he pierced the helmet of the foe. But he was hurried onward by his horse, and before he could repeat the blow with deadlier effect, Orodes was protected by his guards. But the rumour spread among the Parthians that their general was slain, and they yielded. After the ill success of both his sons, Artabanus took the field himself. It was now the moment for Vitellius to intervene. He set his troops in motion, and threatened to invade Mesopotamia. This was the signal for the outbreak of an insurrection which had been long brewing in Parthia, and had been fomented by Roman intrigues. The Parthian nobles, dissatisfied with the rule of the Scythian Artabanus, clamoured for the restoration of a true Arsacid. There was still a surviving son of Phraates at Rome, and a section of the disaffected Parthians sent a secret embassy to Tiberius, requesting that this representative of the house of Arsaces should be sent to the east as a claimant to the Parthian throne. This suited the views of Tiberius, and he acceded to the request. But the candidate for sovereignty died in Syria, and Tiberius then chose Tiridates, a grandson of Phraates, to take his place. The appearance of Vitellius and Tiridates in the Parthian dominions was attended at first with complete success. Sennaches, a man of good family and great wealth, and his father Abdageses, were the leaders of the party hostile to Artabanus, which was largely increased after the disasters in Armenia. Artabanus had soon found himself deserted except by a few foreigners, and was compelled, in order to save his life, to flee into exile among the Scythians. Tiridates then, under the protection of Vitellius and the Roman legions, crossed the Euphrates on a bridge of boats. The first Parthian to enter the camp was Ornospades, formerly a Parthian exile, who had been made a Roman citizen in recognition of aid which he had given to Tiberius in the Dalmatian war, and subsequently returning to Parthia had been received into favour and appointed governor of Mesopotamia. Sennaches and Abdageses arrived soon afterwards with the royal treasure. Then Vitellius, having thus given Tiridates a start, and displayed the Roman eagles beyond the Euphrates, returned with his army to Syria. Nicephorium, Anthemusius, and other towns of Greek foundation, gladly received the new king, expecting him to be a good ruler from his Roman training. The enthusiasm shown by the powerful city of Seleucia, which had preserved intact its Greek character under Parthian domination, was especially encouraging. But Tiridates made a fatal mistake in losing time. Instead of pressing forward into the interior of the country, he delayed over the siege of a fortress in which Artabanus had stored away his treasures and his concubines. In the meantime quarrels broke out among his adherents, some of whom, jealous of the influence of Abdageses, and regarding Tiridates as a Roman dependent, decided to restore Artabanus. They found the exiled monarch in Hyrcania, covered with dirt and sustaining life by his bow. At first he thought that they intended treachery, but when he was assured that they desired his restoration, he hastily raised some auxiliaries in Scythia, and marched against Seleucia with a large force. In order to excite sympathy, he retained the miserable dress which he had worn in his exile. The party of Tiridates retreated into Mesopotamia, and soon dispersed, Tiridates himself returning to Syria, 36 A.D., and leaving Artabanus master of the realm, except Seleucia, which was strong enough to hold out. Vitellius again threatened Mesopotamia, but the restored monarch hastened to yield to the Roman demands, and a peace was concluded. Artabanus recognized Mithridates as king of Armenia, while the Romans undertook not to support the pretensions of Tiridates. The Parthian king also did homage to the image of the Roman emperor, and gave up his son Darius as a hostage. Section 5. Last days and death of Tiberius. Tiberius was not indifferent to the selection of a successor, though he is reported to have once said, quoting the verse of a Greek poet, "When I am dead, let earth be wrapped in flame." There were 3 male representatives of his house on whom his choice might fall. There was his nephew Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the youngest son of the elder Drusus, but he was considered out of the question, as being of weak intellect. There was his grand-nephew Gaius, born in 12 A.D., the youngest son of Germanicus, and there was his grandson Tiberius Gemellus, born 19 A.D., son of Drusus and Livilla. Between these two the choice was practically to be made. The emperor had for a long time slighted Gaius, as being a son of Agrippina, and had not permitted him to assume the toga virilis until his 19th year. But Gaius began to rise, when Sejanus began to decline, in favour. He carefully dissembled any emotions he may have felt at the fate of his mother and brothers, and the people looked forward with satisfaction to a son of Germanicus on the throne. On the other hand, Tiberius may have secretly wished for the succession of his grandson. In 35 A.D. he made a will leaving Gaius and Gemellus joint heirs of his private fortune, and this was equivalent to an expression of his wish that they should be joint heirs of the empire. But there is reason to believe that he regarded Gaius as his successor. The 4 daughters of Germanicus had been married to men of note. Agrippina, of whom we shall hear more, to Cn. Domitius, Drusilla to Cassius Longinus, Julia to Vinicius, the patron of Velleius Paterculus the historian, and a fourth, of unknown name, to the son of Quintilius Varus. His own granddaughter Julia, the widow of Nero, and the betrothed of Sejanus, he married to Rubellius Blandus, a knight of obscure origin. The praetorian prefect Macro, who now partly occupied the place which Sejanus had formerly held at Capreae, saw that Gaius was probably destined to succeed, and sought to obtain an ascendancy over him. Gaius had lost his wife, the daughter of M. Junius Silanus, in the 3rd year of their marriage, and Macro engaged his own wife Ennia to enthrall the young man by her arts and charms. The sharp old Emperor observed the policy of the prefect, and said to him, "You leave the setting sun to court the rising." In the 78th year of his age, in the first months of 37 A.D., Tiberius quitted his island, never to return. He travelled slowly towards Rome and advanced along the Appian Way within 7 miles of the city. He gazed for the last time at the tops of the distant buildings, but frightened by some evil omen, turned back and retraced his steps southward. He was fading fast. At Circeii, in order to hide his weakness, he presided at military exercises, and in consequence of the over-exertion became worse. He tried till the last to conceal his condition from those who were with him, and his physician Charicles had to resort to an artifice to feel his pulse. He breathed his last in the villa of Lucullus at Misenum on March 16, 37 A.D. It was whispered that his end was hastened by Macro, who, seeing him suddenly revive, stifled him. In estimating Tiberius, we must take into account the circumstances of his life, and also the character of the witnesses who have recorded his reign. A Claudian, both on his father's and on his mother's side, descended from the Neros to whom, as Horace sang, Rome owed so much, he had all the pride of his patrician house. He was strong, tall, well made, and healthy, with a fair complexion and long hair profuse at the back of his head, a characteristic of the Claudii. He had unusually large eyes, and a serious expression. In youth he was called the Old Man, so thoughtful was he and slow to speak. He had a strong sense of duty and a profound contempt for the multitude. The spirit of his ancestress, the Claudia who uttered the wish that her brother were alive again, to lose another fleet and make the streets of Rome less crowded, had in some measure descended upon Tiberius. He was, as the originally Sabine name Nero signified, brave and vigorous, and had a conspicuous aptitude for the conduct of affairs. But he was too critical to have implicit confidence in himself, and he was suspicious of others. His self-distrust was increased by the circumstances of his early manhood. His reserved manner, unlike the geniality of his brother Drusus, could not win the affection of his stepfather Augustus, who regarded his peculiarities as faults. And indeed, when he was young enough to have ambition, he was made use of indeed, but he never enjoyed imperial favour. Kept, when possible, in the second place, he was always meeting rebuffs. He was forced to divorce Vipsania, and marry Julia, who brought him nothing but shame. Thus the circumstances of his life and his relations to his stepfather were calculated to deepen his reserve, to embitter his feelings, and produce a habit of dissimulation, so that there is little wonder that a man of his cold, diffident nature, coming to the throne at the age of 55, should not have won the affections of subjects whom he did not deign to conciliate. All his experiences tended to develop in Tiberius that hard spirit, rigor animi, so clearly stamped on his features in the large sitting statue which has been preserved. On the other hand, his diffidence made him dependent on others, first on Livia, and then on Sejanus, who proved his evil genius. In regard to the darker side of his policy as a ruler, we must remember that he had undertaken a task which necessarily involved inconsistencies. He undertook to maintain the republican disguise under which Augustus had veiled the monarchy. The wearing of a mask well suited his reserved and crafty nature, but the success of this pretence depended far more upon personal qualities than Tiberius realized. It had been a success with Augustus because he was popular and genial. It was a failure with Tiberius because he was just the opposite. After Tiberius, the mask was dropped. The system of delation and the law of maiestas were provided by Tiberius as a substitute for the popularity which had shielded his predecessor from conspiracy. Owing to the spread of delation, the reign of Tiberius was to some extent a reign of terror. Hardly any important works of literature were produced, for men did not care to write when they could not write freely. We have already seen the fate of the historian Cremutius Cordus. Two other historians, whose works have come down to us, escaped censure by flattery. In the case of one, the flattery was probably sincere. Velleius Paterculus, whose short Roman history in 2 books was published in 30 A.D., had served under Tiberius in the Pannonian War, and had afterwards risen to the rank of quaestor, and then of praetor. He had conceived a deep admiration and affection for his general, and lauds him with extravagant superlatives. He also speaks in very high terms of Sejanus, who had not yet fallen. Valerius Maximus was more clearly a time-server. In his 9 Books of Memorable Deeds and Words, a collection of anecdotes of Roman history, written in a tasteless, pretentious style, he is servile to the Emperor. But as the work appeared after the fall of Sejanus, a vehement declamation against that minister is introduced. The Spaniard, Annaeus Seneca of Corduba, not to be confounded with his more famous son, was active under Tiberius as well as under Augustus. He wrote a history extending from the beginning of the civil wars almost to the day of his death, about 39 A.D., unfortunately not preserved, but his works on rhetorical subjects are partly extant. The terror of delation did not affect jurists like Masurius Sabinus, men of science like Celsus, or gastronomists like Apicus, owing to the politically indifferent nature of their subjects. It is not easy to see how it affected poetry, but Virgil and Horace had no immediate successors. The only poetical writer of the reign was the freedman Phaedrus, and he tells us that he was persecuted. He was the author of 5 books of Aesopian fables, in iambic trimeters. Pomponius Secundus wrote tragedies, but perhaps did not publish them till after the death of Tiberius. The emperor was himself imbued with letters. He wrote a lyric poem on the death of Lucius Caesar, and Greek verses in the style of the Alexandrine school. He also wrote memoirs of his own life. He was a strict purist in language, and resolutely refused to use words borrowed from Greek. This negative testimony of literature shows that delation was a very real danger and that the government of Tiberius was in some respects tyrannical. But he was not such a tyrant as he had been painted by the later writers Tacitus and Suetonius. Over against the dark picture of Tacitus we must set the opposite picture of the inferior artist Velleius, and we must allow for the bias of both authors. We must remember that Velleius had seen Tiberius at his best, in the camp conducting a campaign, that he received promotion from him and was prejudiced in his favour. In addition to this, he was writing in the Emperor's lifetime. On the other hand, Tacitus wrote under the influence of a reaction against the imperial system, and he lays himself out to blacken the character of all the emperors prior to Nerva. The dark character of Tiberius, and a certain mystery which surrounded his acts and motives, lent themselves well to the design of the skilful historian, who gathered up and did not disdain to record all sorts of popular rumours and stories imputing crime to the exile of Capreae. Apart from the measures which he adopted for his own safety, or at the instigation of Sejanus, and which mainly concerned his own family and nobles connected with them, apart from the consequences of the system of delation, which were felt almost exclusively at Rome, there can be no question that the rule of Tiberius was wise and maintained the general prosperity of the empire. Augustus was not deceived when, in adopting his stepson into the Julian family, he said, "I do it for the public welfare." Nor, on the other hand, was he mistaken when he prophetically pitied the fate of the people of Rome, which he was committing to be masticated in the slow jaws of his adopted son. End of chapter 13, sections 4 to 5.